A quiet tension hung in the air as Jake Marshall, the newly appointed police chief of Havenwood, stepped out of his unmarked sedan. The small Midwestern town, nestled amidst golden cornfields and endless blue skies, had recently made headlines, not for its idyllic charm, but for the troubling controversies within its police department. Jake had spent nearly 3 decades in law enforcement, earning a reputation for taking on the toughest challenges. This time, however, the stakes felt personal. Jake adjusted the brim of his worn baseball cap, his attire deliberately plain, a flannel shirt, faded jeans, and scuffed boots. Nothing about his appearance hinted at his authority or experience. That was the point. He wasn't here for ceremonial welcomes or polished introductions. Jake wanted to see the department unfiltered, without the barriers of rank or rehearsed courtesies. The precinct parking lot buzzed with activity. Officers moved between squad cars, laughing and chatting, as if the world outside their walls didn't weigh heavily on their shoulders. Jake observed silently, his sharp eyes catching snippets of conversation, noticing who carried themselves with purpose and who seemed indifferent. His arrival had been kept under wraps. Only a handful of senior staff knew he'd taken over after the abrupt resignation of the previous chief. He stepped toward the building's side entrance, his boots crunching against the gravel, each step heavy with resolve. For years, the Havenwood Police Department had been a microcosm of everything wrong with modern law enforcement. Unchecked egos, systemic bias, and a growing divide between officers and the community they were sworn to protect. Jake's mission wasn't just to lead. He intended to uproot the toxic culture festering within these walls. As he entered the precinct, the sterile fluorescent lights flickered above, casting a harsh glow on the polished tiles. The stale scent of burnt coffee lingered in the air. Officers barely glanced at him as they went about their routines, immersed in casual banter and paperwork. For now, he was just another face in the crowd. Jake's pulse quickened, but he maintained his calm exterior. He knew the task ahead wouldn't be easy. What he didn't know was that the first crack in the precinct's foundation was about to surface in a way he hadn't anticipated. Jake made his way through the precinct's bustling corridors, his steps measured but deliberate. Conversations flowed freely around him, some lighthearted, others tinged with frustration about a recent case. It was a typical morning at a small-town station, yet something felt off. He could sense the underlying tension, a palpable divide between camaraderie and indifference. This wasn't his first time walking into a troubled department, but Havenwood's reputation preceded it. He paused near the bulletin board by the break room, scanning the clutter of memos, shift schedules, and faded motivational posters. A group of officers stood nearby, sipping coffee and trading half-hearted laughs. Jake stayed quiet, letting their conversation drift his way. It didn't take long to confirm what he'd suspected. Some of the officers carried an arrogance that spoke louder than their words. "Hey, you!" The sharp voice cut through the chatter like a knife. Jake turned slowly, his gaze meeting the speakers. A stocky man in his early 30s strode toward him, his uniform perfectly pressed, his badge polished to a mirror-like shine. The nameplate read, "Officer Perry." His swagger was unmistakable, as was the smug grin stretched across his face. "You lost or something?" Perry asked, his voice laced with mockery. Behind him, a few other officers leaned casually against the wall, watching the exchange with thinly veiled amusement. Jake opened his mouth to respond, but Perry didn't give him the chance. "This isn't a shelter," he continued, gesturing dismissively at Jake's plain clothes. "You look like you wandered in off the street. Need directions, buddy?" The snickers from Perry's audience grew louder. Jake clenched his jaw, forcing himself to remain calm. He'd seen men like Perry before, officers who mistook the badge for a license to demean rather than protect. "Just passing through," Jake replied evenly, his voice betraying none of the storm brewing inside him. "Passing through?" Perry scoffed, stepping closer. "Well, pass right on out. We don't need freeloaders hanging around. You're not welcome here." The laughter swelled, and one of the bystanders muttered, "Show him the door, Perry." Jake's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he allowed the scene to unfold, every word and action cementing his understanding of the culture he was about to dismantle. Then, without warning, Perry leaned in, his face inches from Jake's. "I said, get out," he spat, his tone venomous. And then it happened. Perry spit directly in Jake's face. Time seemed to freeze. The laughter turned into a stunned silence as the saliva dripped down Jake's cheek. His mind raced, his pulse roaring in his ears. Every instinct screamed for him to respond, to put Perry in his place right then and there. But Jake knew better. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a clean handkerchief. Slowly, deliberately, he wiped his face, his movements calm and composed. "Is this how you treat everyone who walks through those doors?" Jake asked, his voice steady but carrying a quiet authority. Perry smirked, his confidence unwavering. "Only the ones who don't belong," he shot back. The crowd of officers erupted into laughter again, emboldened by Perry's bravado. Jake said nothing further. He turned on his heel and walked away, leaving Perry and his cohorts behind. His footsteps echoed down the hallway, each step a reminder that the real reckoning was just beginning. As he made his way toward the precinct's main office, the intercom crackled to life. "All personnel report to the briefing room immediately," a voice announced. Jake smiled faintly. It was time! The briefing room buzzed with conversation as officers filed in, some clutching steaming mugs of coffee, others exchanging inside jokes. The walls were adorned with bulletin boards layered in years of notices, training schedules, and faded commendations. A whiteboard at the front of the room displayed the precinct's motto, "Protect and serve with integrity." The irony wasn't lost on Jake as he stepped in quietly through a side door, a folder bearing the department's official seal tucked under his arm. He stood just out of sight, observing. Officer Perry leaned casually against the back wall, his arms crossed, the same smug expression still plastered across his face. His earlier antics had evidently become the talk of the precinct, as a few officers cast knowing glances in his direction, barely containing their laughter. The room reeked of unearned confidence. At the podium, Captain Mitchell Harris, a stout man with a neatly trimmed graying mustache, called for order. His voice boomed over the chatter. "Settle down, everyone. We've got an important introduction this morning." The officers gradually quieted, their curiosity piqued. Mitchell continued, his tone serious, yet tinged with pride. "As most of you know, Chief Dempsey retired last month, leaving some big shoes to fill. Today, we're welcoming someone new, a man with a distinguished career and a clear vision for this department." Jake stepped into view, his measured strides silencing the room. The moment he reached the podium, the energy in the room shifted. The officers stared, their expressions transforming from amusement to confusion, then dawning realization. Perry's smirk faded instantly. The color drained from his face, his bravado dissolving as recognition settled in. The man he'd humiliated mere minutes ago was now standing in front of the entire precinct, his boss. Jake placed the folder on the lectern, scanning the room. His calm demeanor only heightened the tension. Finally, he spoke, his voice steady and commanding. "Good morning. My name is Jake Marshall, and as of today, I am your new chief of police." A heavy silence fell over the room. Officers exchanged uneasy glances, some whispering, others frozen in their seats. Perry shifted uncomfortably, sweat beading on his brow as his eyes darted toward the exit. There was no escape from the moment he'd created. Jake's gaze lingered on Perry just long enough to ensure the message was clear before addressing the rest of the room. "When I arrived this morning, I came dressed as an ordinary man, not as your chief. I did this because I wanted to see this department for what it truly is, unfiltered, without the polish of rehearsed welcomes or the facade of respect." A murmur rippled through the crowd, but Jake raised a hand to silence it. His tone sharpened. What I witnessed was eye-opening. Behaviors that are not just unprofessional, but fundamentally unacceptable. Let me make one thing clear. The culture that has been allowed to thrive here ends today. Perry squirmed, his once confident posture crumbling under Jake's unrelenting gaze. The tension in the room was palpable as Jake stepped closer to the edge of the podium, his presence commanding. "Respect," he continued, "is not optional. It's the foundation of law enforcement, the core of what we do. Without it, we fail, not just each other, but the community we serve." Jake's voice cut through the room like a blade. "This morning, I witnessed some of you laughing at what you thought was just another powerless man being put in his place. Let me remind you, everyone who walks through those doors deserves respect, whether they wear a badge or not." His words hung in the air, heavy with conviction. Perry's discomfort was now impossible to hide. He avoided Jake's eyes, his face a deep shade of red. Jake let the silence stretch before delivering the final blow. Effective immediately, Officer Perry is suspended pending an internal investigation into his conduct. Let this be clear. This is not a punishment. It's the beginning of a new standard. If you can't rise to meet it, this isn't the place for you. Gasps rippled through the room. Perry's jaw tightened, and he glared at the floor, refusing to meet the stares of his peers. Jake stepped back from the podium, scanning the room one last time. For those of you ready to move forward, to be better, we will rebuild this department together. But know this, I will hold you accountable every step of the way. The officers left the room in a heavy silence, the usual chatter replaced by the weight of Jake's words. Perry stormed out, his face twisted with anger and shame. Jake remained at the podium, watching the transformation unfold. This was only the beginning, but the foundation for change had been laid. The precinct remained unusually quiet after the briefing. The typical banter and casual conversations had been replaced by hushed murmurs and stolen glances. The shock of the morning's events was still fresh, and no one wanted to be the next to draw Jake Marshall's attention. For some, the new chief's decisive actions were a wake-up call. For others, like Officer Perry, it was a humiliation they couldn't easily stomach. Back in his office, Jake sat at his desk, flipping through personnel files. The folder he carried into the briefing room contained more than just an introduction. It held records of complaints and misconduct, many of which had been swept under the rug for years. Officer Perry's file was particularly concerning. A litany of accusations ranging from excessive force to demeaning behavior, most of which had been quietly dismissed or ignored. Jake made a note to personally review every one of them. The phone on his desk rang, breaking the silence. It was Captain Mitchell Harris. "Chief, I wanted to say, you handled that better than most would have," Harris said cautiously. "Perry's been a problem for years, but no one's ever had the guts to deal with him head-on." "Thanks, Captain," Jake replied, his tone measured. "But the real work starts now. I need a full review of Perry's history, complaints, incident reports, everything. Have it on my desk by tomorrow." "You've got it," Harris said. After a pause, he added, "You shook a lot of people this morning, in a good way." Jake hung up, leaning back in his chair for a moment. He wasn't here to win friends or inspire admiration. His mission was clear: dismantle the culture of complacency and rebuild the department on a foundation of respect and accountability. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but he was prepared for the long road ahead. Over the next few days, the ripple effects of Perry's suspension became evident. The once confident officer was now an outcast, avoided by his peers who feared association with him. Whispers spread throughout the precinct as officers realized the old rules no longer applied. Jake made it a point to walk the halls daily, his presence a constant reminder that things were changing. For Jake, accountability wasn't about punishment, it was about setting a new standard. And Perry's suspension was just the first step. The tension in the precinct lingered in the days following Officer Perry's suspension, but something else began to take root: reflection. Conversations were quieter, more measured. Officers who once thrived on bravado and intimidation seemed to tread carefully, their usual swagger tempered by uncertainty. Jake's message had landed, and its impact was unmistakable. Walking the precinct halls each day, Jake made a deliberate effort to engage with his team. He greeted every officer he passed, his demeanor firm yet approachable. He understood that leadership wasn't just about enforcing change, but fostering it. His presence was a constant reminder that the department was under new leadership, one that demanded accountability and respect. One afternoon, Jake was approached by Officer Reyes, a young recruit with barely a year on the force. Her expression was a mix of apprehension and determination as she stepped into Jake's office. "Chief," she began hesitantly, "I need to say something." Jake gestured for her to continue. "I've been complicit," Reyes admitted, her voice heavy with guilt. "Not directly, but by staying silent. I laughed at jokes I shouldn't have. I went along with things because, well, I was scared of retaliation, but I don't want to be that officer anymore." Jake leaned forward, his gaze steady. "Acknowledging it is the first step, Reyes. Change starts with you, but it doesn't stop there. You'll need to hold yourself and others accountable, even when it's uncomfortable." Reyes nodded, her resolve hardening. "I'm ready, Chief." Jake's words were kind but firm. "That's all I ask. If you're willing to do the work, we can rebuild this department together." For every Raya's willing to step up, there were officers who resisted the change, clinging to the old ways. Jake knew transforming the culture wouldn't be a clean sweep. Still, small victories like this gave him hope that change, however slow, was possible. On a crisp Saturday morning, Jake attended a community event held in Havenwood Central Park. Families gathered under the autumn sun, enjoying music, food stalls, and games. For years, events like this had been overshadowed by mistrust between the community and the police force. Jake knew that rebuilding that trust would take more than words. It required action and presence. As he mingled with attendees, Jake spotted a young boy standing hesitantly near the police booth, his small hands tucked into his jacket pockets. The boy's wide eyes followed Jake, curiosity and apprehension written across his face. Jake approached slowly, crouching down to meet the child's gaze. "Hey there," Jake said with a warm smile. "What's your name?" "Marcus," the boy replied, barely above a whisper. "Well, Marcus, it's nice to meet you. Are you having fun today?" The boy hesitated before speaking again. "Are you really the chief?" Jake nodded. "I am. What about it?" Marcus looked down, shuffling his feet. "My dad says the police don't care about us." Jake's smile softened, his voice gentle but firm. "I can't change the past, Marcus, but I promise we're working hard to do better. And if you ever need help, you can come find me, okay?" Marcus's face brightened with a small smile. "Okay." Moments like this reminded Jake why he'd taken the job. The road to change was long, but every step forward, every bridge rebuilt, brought them closer to a future where trust and respect weren't just aspirations, they were reality. As the months passed, the changes Jake had implemented, the precinct was far from perfect, but it was undeniably different. Officers who couldn't adapt to the new culture had quietly left, replaced by recruits who shared Jake's vision for accountability and respect. Training sessions on implicit bias and community engagement became a regular part of the department's routine. And slowly, the walls of mistrust between the precinct and the town began to crumble. One evening, Jake stood in the main hallway of the precinct, watching as officers filed out after their shifts. The laughter and camaraderie he heard were no longer at someone else's expense. It felt genuine, inclusive. He allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction, knowing these changes weren't just cosmetic, they were foundational. Jake's gaze lingered on a group of young officers chatting animatedly about a case they had just wrapped up. Among them was Officer Reyes, her confidence evident as she shared her insights. Seeing her transformation reminded Jake of the potential for growth in even the most unlikely places. The road ahead was still long, but Jake felt hopeful. Change was never easy, but with every step forward, he was proving that it was worth the fight.